promotion as well. To say brother. Ron Inglis will come and speak, and then Lieutenant Colonel Anne Hodge, and then the lovely Bev Knight. So I did give you a promotion. There you go. So Ron, will you greet Ron, please?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Papua New Guinea, the last unknown. Papua New Guinea, Australia's closest neighbour, lies just to our north, just south of the equator. It is a land of rugged mountains, enervating heat and humidity, thunderous tropical rain, and short, mighty rivers. A mantle of equatorial rainforest covers much of the land, and there are extensive swamps and patches of tropical grassland. The terrain is often described as impossible, and earthquakes are common. Being near the equator, I certainly remember the time in 1971 when I, as a National Service Sergeant Instructor, appointed to the Pacific Islands Regiment, arrived at Port Moresby and got out of the plane, and it hit me that it was just like stepping into an oven. And I thought, to walk across the tarmac, I'm not going to survive this. And, but in the end, spent a very productive and worthwhile year in that wonderful country. Papua New Guinea was frequently referred to as the last unknown. Certainly in 1956, many parts of the country had yet to be explored. It was, using the term correctly, one of the most primitive places on Earth. Hundreds of isolated tribes and languages, limited contact with the outside world, lives lived in village poverty, witchcraft, ancestor worship and cargo cults. If any place in the world could be classified as missionary territory, then Papua New Guinea was it. The Australian Eastern Territory missionary officers honour roll. I consulted this honour roll, which is now in the prayer room of our headquarters there in Redfern, and I discovered that the first officers appointed to Papua New Guinea, there were all 7 of them, were all appointed on the 1st of July 1994. Now I immediately thought, that can't be right. We all know that the Salvation Army flag was planted officially on permanent work in 1956. Where were the names of Major and Mrs. Keith Baker and Lieutenant Ian Cutmore? They're not there. The explanation is that between 1956 and 1994, Papua New Guinea was part of the Eastern Territory, so appointments to PNG were considered to be homeland appointments. The names of officers so appointed to Papua New Guinea in that time period were not recorded on the original missionary honour roll. Only from 1994, when Papua New Guinea became a region under international headquarters, were the officers appointed to Papua New Guinea considered to be real missionaries to a foreign field. And thus arose the project that Don referred to for the Historical Society. We would investigate this forgotten missionary episode in the history of the Australian Eastern Territory. And it was certainly a most distinguished chapter in the history of that territory. The Historical Society has the vision to record and celebrate the work of the Salvation Army in Papua New Guinea. How were we to do that? Well, the most important role was compiling a roll of those who served in Papua New Guinea in that period, 1956 to 1994. there was no such official roll kept, no honour roll for those officers. And this enormous task has been completed largely by Lieutenant Colonel Pam Hodge, and she will speak to that in just a moment. Secondly, we wanted to write up the stories of many of these pioneer officers that worked in Papua New Guinea during that time period, and at times their work has largely been forgotten. It hasn't been written up. Even in some of the war cry obituaries, there is very limited detail on what those officers did while they were serving in Papua New Guinea. Thirdly, we would encourage the collection of archive material and setting up a PNG display in our wonderful new museum there at Auburn. If any of you haven't visited there, the lift is working now. They have a new lift.
Hallelujah.
So there is no excuse, and it's a great display, and you will thoroughly enjoy the time you spend over there. And the wonderful thing is it's right in the centre of a very active Salvation Army Corps and Social Services Centre, so you can visit those areas as well. It's well worth the visit. Spying out the land. Of course, there was Salvation Army work in Papua New Guinea prior to 1956, as our first slide here will show. I grew up knowing all the stories about the Red Shield, the Kokoda Track and the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. We selected this particular photograph simply because my father's in it, and so it's a particularly important one. However, today we are focusing on the beginning of permanent work, establishing the Salvation Army among the Indigenous population. Here are some of the steps leading up to the official launching. It was in fact way back in 1941, before the war in the Pacific had erupted, that Commissioner William Dalziel was flown to PNG at government expense to sound out what the Salvation Army could do in the territory. The colonial officials had many projects that they were keen for the Salvation Army to take up, and they invited our Commissioner to come and speak about these things. On his return journey, he stopped overnight in Townsville. There were no through flights in those days. He stopped overnight in Townsville and discussed Papua New Guinea with the Townsville Corps officers, who were none other than Captain and Mrs. Keith Baker. Little did they know that 15 years later they would be the officers appointed to officially open the work. Then in 1955, IHQ approved the Papua New Guinea venture, but it was with the proviso that the Eastern Territory took full responsibility for staffing and for financing. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Scotney and Senior Captain George Carpenter were appointed by Commissioner Edgar Grinstead to undertake a fact-finding tour. Scotney and Carpenter were advised by the Minister for Territories, the Honourable Paul Hasluck, who was son of Salvation Army officers and later served as Governor-General. I also found out from one of Alison's articles in Under the Tricolour that young Paul Hasluck, as a boy, accompanied his parents to the Salvation Army's International Congress of 1914. They received from Paul Hasluck a considerable help with contacts and letters of introduction. So Scotney and Carpenter land in Port Moresby on the 23rd of September 1955 for a 9-day fact-finding tour, and they report back to Commissioner Grinstead, who gives the green light to go ahead in this adventure. The Salvation Army officially opens fire. Major Keith Baker arrived at Port Moresby at 9:30 a.m. on the 31st of August 1956 after an overnight flight from Brisbane. He's accompanied by Captain George Carpenter, who would stay on for 6 weeks, helping Baker make the contacts that had been made the previous year and helping him settle in. Not long after their arrival, Baker and Carpenter basically repeated the exploratory tour of the previous year, and they visited Goroka, Lae, Rabaul, Madang, Wewak, and even crossing the border over into Dutch East Indies, visiting Hollandia, which is now of course Jurapira in Indonesian territory. Now we have displayed here just the front cover of the copy of Papua Panorama, which is an excellent book written by George Carpenter when he returned, published by the Salvation Army, and it's an excellent read. It gives a really good insight into colonial Papua New Guinea in 1955-56 and the opportunities for the Salvation Army, possibilities there. And so yes, if you do get hold of Papua Panorama, it's quite a good read, well worth it. Now Carpenter returned to Australia in October 1956, leaving Keith Baker there all by himself. Captain Edna Baker had remained in Australia to make arrangements in Brisbane for Judith, who was just 14 years of age at the time, for her to finish high school in Brisbane. And Edna and her 2 younger children, Margaret and Bram, they arrived in Papua New Guinea on the 25th of January 1957. Now, we have photos here. Yes, the first one there. Major Keith Baker speaking with some of the new soldiers recruited in Papua New Guinea. And then we have the second photo of Edna Baker. This was taken at a later date when she is up in the highlands at the mobile clinic there, and indicating the sort of, particularly in the highlands, the primitive, isolated, primitive work that was begun. They were really true pioneers. Well, I concentrated a bit of study just on that first year, 1957. And in that year, there were just 3 Salvation Army officers stationed in Papua New Guinea. That is, the Bakers and Ian Cutmore. He had arrived on the 11th of November 1956 to join Captain Baker, as he said, as his armour bearer. And one of the interesting things about on that day, the 11th of November, when Ian Cutmore arrived, he wrote in his memoirs that that was the day that the Duke of Edinburgh had finished his tour of Papua New Guinea and was proceeding to Australia to open the Olympic Games down in Melbourne of that year. And of course, therefore, there was all the ceremony and all the troops lined up to farewell the Duke of Edinburgh. Well, they all still sprang there, and when Ian Cutmore and the others, it was all, you know, the standard to attention. Great welcome for him. But I realised that in that first year, they had to do everything from scratch. They didn't even have accommodation. They had to rely on local expatriates, say going on furlough to Australia and allowing their home to be used. And the Bakers moved something like 5 or 6 times in that first year. Yet in that time, they had to find accommodation, they had to submit proposals to government authorities, they had to establish links to existing churches, missionary societies and service organisations. They had to build home support, prepare budgets, open bank accounts, order supplies, submit reports to headquarters, organise transport, conduct indoor and outdoor meetings, establish Sunday schools and home leagues, make converts, build a quarters and a citadel. And not to mention bringing Kay Gino to the Sydney Congress of 1957 for him to be enrolled by Commissioner Grinstead as the first convert in Papua New Guinea. In fact, they didn't move into the unfinished quarters at Morocco till September 1957, and then the first hall at Morocco was opened in December of that year. Now, of course, there are many, many other people who served in the subsequent years, and Pam will be dealing with that in just a moment. Let's just focus just for a moment on those pioneers, the Bakers. I read in this particular history of the Salvation Army in Papua New Guinea, not a bad sort of history by Major Alan Satterley. However, reading through this about the Bakers, I came across this paragraph. Now just listen to this. The Bakers were an excellent selection. A gifted and experienced couple, they could fully understand how the army should operate while appreciating what it means to pioneer in a new country. And certainly they were. But then this. As with most Salvation Army officer couples at the time, the administrative load fell mostly on the man. I had to look at that again. Really? Then the next sentence, Major Keith Baker was an achiever with a tenacious, single-minded determination to go for what he knew was best for the army. Where's the mention? Where's the mention of Mrs. Keith Baker? No mention at all. No mention of the fact that Mrs. Baker had already 4 years' experience as a missionary. She was appointed in 1936 as Captain Amos, and she was part of an international team of officers that was gathered together to open Salvation Army work in Canton in the newly established South China Territory. She spent, initially spending 3 days as an assistant officer of a corps and then 2 days on headquarters to help out with administration. There was no mention of her literacy ability as evidenced by the many war cry articles she wrote from China. She clearly had great literacy talent. And no mention of her finance skills. After all, she'd gone into college from employment in a bank. We're just, if the next display, yes. See that diary that the Salvation Army Museum holds? It says, The Miracle of Papua New Guinea, Major Keith Baker. And you go through it and there's a detailed, day-by-day record of that first year. No doubt. Now, I'm familiar with all the war cry articles that Captain Edna Ramos wrote, and I'm also familiar with this memoir that she wrote in 1986, and when I read that diary, I said, this was not written by Keith Baker. You know? This has the hand of Edna Baker all over it. She was an organiser, and I believe she deserves much greater recognition for pioneering the work in Papua New Guinea than she was given credit for. Indeed, I would argue that Edna Baker was the first Chief Secretary and the first financial officer of the Salvation Army in Papua New Guinea. It was in 1985, that was the centenary of the Burwood Corps, and I was Corps Sergeant Major there at the time, writing up the centenary brochure. And at the suggestion of Colonel Lily Sampson, she said, you ought to go out and interview Mrs. Baker because she grew up in Burwood Corps. Her mother was Corps Cadet Guardian, and it was right up, she was in Burwood Corps right up until her mid-teens when they transferred to Parramatta. And so I went out there, and Joy and I had a very nice time speaking with them. Of course, our questions were mainly all about the early days of Burwood Corps, but I didn't really ask her very much about Papua New Guinea, but I knew it, and when we discussed a little bit of that, I then said to her, and what did you do when you were up in Papua New Guinea? And she sort of replied rather sardonically, oh, I was just the officer's wife. Oh, two other, let's have the next photo, yes. Two other very significant pioneers, finish with these two, were Ruby Dalrymple and Dorothy Elphick. Now someone needs to write up the story of Ruby Dalrymple. She served for 10 years on that clinic. In fact, she and Dorothy Elphick was a New Zealand officer, and on commissioning she came across here, and the two of them took this vehicle up all around New South Wales and Queensland, like a field unit, just to get the hang of it. And then they went together to Papua New Guinea, and when the accommodation was provided for them up in the Kainan 2, they began that marvellous work up there in the most primitive, remote areas of Papua New Guinea. And of course we see here that the great contribution that the Eastern Territory made right from the start. Of course, the one on the right is Dorothy Elphick. Her story has been written up by Major Barbara Sampson over there in New Zealand, and they tell me that today Dorothy Elphick is still hale and hearty, and at 96 years of age, and living in a rest home in Auckland, and again a wonderful pioneer. Now just finally, that last photograph that we have there, this is a photograph that appeared in Satterley's book saying in 1957, but it can't be 1957 because there are other officers there. I think by the look of it it's more 1958, 59. It shows just the bottom line. We believe the bottom two officers on the left are the rumps who were appointed to be the first administrators of the Koki hostel there. Then there are the bakers, and then of course Lieutenant Ian Cutmore. Nancy Cutmore didn't come up there until 1960. Now the second row there on the left, of course, is Dorothy Stevens, also out of Burwood Court, and of course she had a long and distinguished career, marrying Lionel Crown, and of course eventually regional commanders there. So somebody needs to write up the story of Dorothy Stevens. It's certainly a lot. Now just jumping to the right, that's Ruby Dalrymple. The other one, again, as I mentioned, her story needs to be written up. It's not Dorothy Elphick. Dorothy Elphick's not in that photograph. We've checked. And that, of course, the one in the middle, where the Pam has sorted that out. She'll let us know in a minute. We're not certain who the one in the middle of that row is.
Faith Roach.
So you think it's Faith Roach? Oh, excellent, excellent. Anybody written up the story of Faith Roach? Was she an officer? School teacher. Oh, you better write up a story. Out of Bankstown, right? All right, so let me hand over to Pam so that we can talk about the honour roll of those who served in that era, and perhaps, and I do hope that as a result of this meeting today, you have connections, you have archive material, make connection with our museum, and we will make progress with this project.
I remember being just a young girl in Benchtown Court, and we were at the railway station one Sunday night in the open air, and this Salvationist walked along and everybody said, "Oh, it's Faith Roach, it's Faith Roach, she's been in Papua New Guinea." An introduction to that. Hopefully there is a power.
waiting, we have someone here who took Faith Roach out to the pictures one night. Not me.
You should write the story.
Oh, you obviously write up the story.
Not as ready.
Did she spend long in Papua New Guinea? How long was she in Papua New Guinea?
I lost track. She went from Enfield to Newtown to be the YYPSN, and then she went to college. And she disappeared after that.
I first started looking at who had served in Papua New Guinea in 2006. We were privileged here at Hurstville to hold a weekend honouring service in Papua New Guinea. I became aware that nobody had ever come, nobody who had come back from Papua New Guinea had ever been briefed or honoured because it was part of our territory. It was like somebody coming from Mount Isa, I suppose. Thank you. So, at that time, to invite people to the weekends, we made up lists. It was very difficult to find lists. Brigadier and Mrs. Rumpf, I was horrified to find that there was nowhere recorded what her Christian name was. She was just Mrs. Rumpf. Wasn't in the dispo, wasn't anywhere, and I was really cross because she'd been to Papua New Guinea and served, and we didn't even know what her Christian name was. But as I was doing these lists, and I've had great joy in doing them, it suddenly occurred to me what an incredible gift Australia and some other territories had given to Papua New Guinea and to God for the Salvation Army in human resources. There were so many people, and my records are not complete, but
I'm having trouble here. Just try and get... Sorry. Pam's the author of this. This is another one. Sorry about this.
I'll just
One
talk
open, sorry.
Okay. So, in total, on my list, I have 182 officers served in Papua New Guinea, other than the Papuan and New Guinean officers, who went together as missionaries, went from a number of different places. 161 officers came from the Australian Eastern Territory. 161 came from the Australian Eastern Territory. 8 officers came from the Southern Territory, Australian Southern. 11 officers came from New Zealand, and we heard about the first one who served up there early on. 1 officer came from the United Kingdom, and 1 officer came from the USA. So it was an interesting group of people. Should I just stop? Wait just keep going. There were quite a number of officers who served long term. Edna and Keith Baker, Ian and Nancy Cutmore, and it was interesting that both of Ian and Nancy's children, the Cutmore children, went and served as lay workers at different times further on. Evanville Mole, served there a number of times and for a long term. And your dad served before, Bill's dad, Major Bill Senior, served there before Evanville. The Gateses, Isabel and Don Gates, served a number of times, a number of terms. Cecil Williams served a number of times. Joy Johns, Envoy Joy Johns, an incredible lady. She served 8 years in Papua New Guinea as the secretary to the regional commander. And at the end of that 8 years, they made her an envoy. But she served as a lay worker for 8 years. And then Carol and John Major from New Zealand served in Papua New Guinea as lay workers and then came back as officers after they were commissioned. It's a shame you can't have that photo because I had a lovely photo of Bill and Karen. And the officers served in a number of different roles, mainly nurses and mainly teachers. But there were a lot in administration. There were quite a number of Australian officers who served as regional commanders in Papua New Guinea. Now, this is where my figures become less accurate. I have a total of 140 lay workers who served in Papua New Guinea. Now, I think that figure's right. But where they came from is debated. We had 108 officers who came from the Eastern Territory, 14 from the Southern Territory, 11 from New Zealand, 3 from the USA, 1 from Switzerland, 2 from the Philippines, and 4 folk who went to Papua New Guinea who weren't army to start with. Some of them became soldiers once they were up there. And in my list of lay workers, I've got a lot of places that I don't know where they came from. So these figures are not quite, because they could be from New Zealand, they could have been from Southern Territory and more from the Eastern Territory. So I'm going to leave this list over here on this table, and if any of you like to look through it and you know somebody, you know where they came from, that would be wonderful. It's much easier to find where the officers came from because we could look up cadet lists and so forth. The lay workers, many of them, a good portion of them, went up to do the E-course. You could teach in a school in New Guinea and Papua in grade kinder and 1 without any qualifications at all. And then the Papuan government established this E-course that was a 6-month course, 6-month course, and many of our lay workers did it. And I remember when I was growing up thinking about, hearing about that E-course and thinking it would be great to go and do that. The first officer to do it was Captain Wynne Williams. Dot Stevens was the first, thank you. I told her before that she would need to correct me. So Dot Stevens was the first officer. Wynne Williams also did the E-course. There were 38 lay workers who served in Papua New Guinea who came home to Australia and became officers and auxiliary officers. There were 10 folk who were lay workers or who worked in government or other companies in Papua New Guinea who came to the training college from a corps in Papua New Guinea. Now this is not going to be right, this figure. There were at least 12 lay workers who completed the E-course, and then they were equipped to teach in army schools. Finally up there. Good. Okay. This is where I'm up to this one. That was Alison Moores, who came from Hurstville, who went up and back a number of times. And the next one. exhibition. And this is Envoy Joy Johns. This was the day she was farewelled from THQ with her mum and dad. There were at least 12 lay workers who met their spouses in Papua New Guinea. Either other lay workers or some of the folks were working for government and others. I found out that there were 4 single girls living in the one house, and all of them found their spouses in Papua New Guinea. A number of officers and lay workers encouraged their relatives to come up to Papua New Guinea. Don and Isabel Gates, who were incredible pioneers, both of Isabel's sisters came up and served in Papua New Guinea as lay workers, and one of them was an army, but she came. Marina Ellis, she was. Randall, she talked about her husband Cliff came to work as a lay worker in Papua New Guinea. He wasn't army. He talked to somebody across the fence and he wanted to do something overseas. And I don't know who the person was over the fence. but he told him about that he could go to Papua New Guinea. And he did. A number of lay workers returned to Papua New Guinea as officers. And then in this last video, these folk, now there could be more, but these folk, just look at that. These 3 folks were promoted to glory as a result of their service in Papua New Guinea. Mari, we know well. John Gill, Captain John Gill, he was a prison chaplain there, and he was beat up and died as a result of his beating by a gang. And Olwen Harris went to Papua New Guinea as Olwen Hinckley, Major Mrs. Hinckley's daughter, and she served as a lay worker. She met Green Harris, and unfortunately she became ill. It was really quite sad because they thought she was pregnant, and they were great joy because she was pregnant, but it wasn't a pregnancy, it was a growth, and she died. And if she hadn't have been Papua New Guinea, I'm sure the medical services would have been. So at least these 3 Australians have given their life. We have got a book. Mari Hodge wrote home to her mum regularly, every week, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And I had the joy of typing up all of Mari's letters, and we put them in a book, Letters Home. So if anybody would like a copy of the book, we're selling it for $10, and the money's going to Bay Village, where John and Mari served. And my list, I will put it on the table. I would love to fill in. Ron set me a very difficult task when he sort of suggested that I could do this. He wanted the name, the home corps or the territory, the occupation, the date they arrived, the date they farewelled, and what position they held in Papua New Guinea. So it was much easier to do it for officers. I've been through the dispos and got a number of things, but I've got a number of gaps, as you can see on this first page. So I will leave it here, and if you people who served in Papua New Guinea, please come and fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to introduce to you this afternoon Bev Miles. She is a most experienced person in terms of service in Papua New Guinea during that period, 1956 to 1994. Now, we're just going to run through a couple of questions chronologically. So firstly, could you start off, Bev, with just telling us something about your home core, where you grew up, what you went to school, just some basic background.
When I was born, my parents were soldiers of Waterloo Corps.
Hallelujah.
Later transferred to Leichhardt Corps, and by 1959 there were no young people in the Corps except my brothers and sisters and myself, and I badly wanted to transfer to Petersham. And Mum said, not until you finished your leaving certificate. So when I finished my leaving certificate, I went to Petersham.
Now, could you give us the indication of when was it that you heard about this idea of service in Papua New Guinea, and what was motivating your thinking at that time which led you to accept that invitation? How did it all come about?
Well, from before I started school, I wanted to be a school teacher, and I would sit my brothers and sisters in front while I stood out in front and gave orders. And then as I grew up, I think I was at a Corkadec council or something at Marrickville Town Hall, and I was about 14 or 15, and God said to me that I should be a Salvation Army officer. So I thought, right, finish high school, go to Teachers College, get some experience, go to the training college, and then go to Africa. That was the big thing in those days. But I didn't work hard enough at high school. I didn't get a Teachers College certificate, Teachers College scholarship, and I became a very angry young lady. But in 1964-65 at the Colorado Youth Camp, and some of you people were there, Captain Dorothy Stevens came to talk about the E-course. 6 months teacher training, and you could teach grades prep to 6. Before that you could teach prep 1 and 2 with a certificate. And the Salvation, I think Doc was on a recruitment drive, the Salvation Army wanted more people to go. So I went in May 1965. And I thought, plan B. Just 6 months, 2 years. I was there 3 months. And God said, full time.
That's great. Now let's just stick with that part where you first went there, you did the E-course, and then what actually did you do after that? What sort of situation were you in after that?
When Doc did the E-course, there was her and Jane Farthing, who was a cadet on our training, engaged to Ross Callahan, who was teaching up there. But she was at Teachers College in Rabaul, and he was teaching at Boragina. I doubt they even saw each other in the time that she was there. But the E-course that I did was strictly mission people. Anglican, Catholic, Lutheran, SDA, Swiss Evangelical Brotherhood, Sally's. Just, they'd never had one at the Teachers College that was just all Christians, basically. So that was an experience in itself. After we graduated, I was appointed to Ongamuga, and I wasn't really happy about that. I wanted to go to Kainantu, where Doc was. I came home on leave, and when I went back, my appointment had been changed, and I was appointed to Kainantu. So I served with Dot, Beulah Harris, she was then, and Beulah's sister Maureen was a certificate teacher, and Dot Stevens, and we shared a house in Kainantu. And I taught for 2 years.
Now, could we come to the romantic part? How is it that you came involved with this character, Bill Miles?
Well, the fact of the matter is, Maureen left and we needed to find another teacher. Maureen and Beulah shared a bedroom. The house was fibro outside, the internal walls were woven bamboo, pit. There was no privacy. I could hear everything she said to Maureen in her room, I just talked through the wall. I didn't have to walk out the door. One night I was kneeling beside my bed praying, and the bed shook. And the bed shook again. And then things started falling off the shelf. And Beulah said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, that's a guria." In other words, an earth tremor. And as somebody said, there were plenty of those. And Maureen and Beulah were sharing this bedroom. There was a bed and a space in between and a wardrobe. But when Maureen left, we needed to find a new teacher. And to expect somebody, Beulah, to share a room with somebody she didn't know just wasn't the ideal. But there was a house on the property that could be renovated, and the plan was for Dot and me to go and live in that house, and the replacement teacher to live with Beulah in the main house. And the person who renovated the house is sitting over there. And while he was renovating this house, he was living next door with Bert George, who was another teacher. And the quicker this house was finished, the quicker we could move. So after tea at night, when I'd finished my prep for the next day, I'd go over and paint the walls or whatever it was he wanted done so that we could get this house finished, not realising that I was being looked at.
So now I understand you came back down, you were married down here in Sydney, and then, now can you take us the story then, how did you end up becoming officers? What's your appointments there, in particular, getting back to New Guinea?
I left Moresby in January '66. Bill arrived. The day I left Moresby to go to Cornette, Bill arrived from Australia to be in PNG, and he was an officer. I filled in my candidate's papers and was accepted in July 67, I beg your pardon, went to Congress in September 67, and this man who had helped to paint my house asked me out for supper. And I thought, oh. And then and I said, well, I have my mother and sister with me. Oh, they can come too. So we went out for supper. The next day, on the Sunday, he invited me out to dinner the next night. And I said, oh, I'm going to a candidate's tea. But when I got back to Konantu, I said to Beulah, I really should write and thank him. He was very kind to us while we were there. He took us places. So I wrote a letter, and I said, what do you think? Change that. So between us, we compiled this letter, sent it off. Correspondence began back and forth. And by December, we'd asked permission to court officially. I hadn't changed my candidate's papers, which said there was no man in my life. I wasn't engaged, I wasn't married. And when he came on leave, he proposed. I told my mother. She said, what? And I said, don't fret. He's going back to Moresby. I'm going to college. We get married in 2 years' time. Don't worry about it. It'll be okay. So we were married at Parramatta in 1970. We were appointed to Onamuga. Bill was the station manager and corps officer. I taught grade 5. That year, the house we were living in had been there since the beginning of the army at Onamuga. It was rotted with the slums falling apart, all local materials except for the iron roof. Headquarters deemed that the new quarters had to be built on that site. 200 acres, but on that site. We moved house 3 times that year, and by the end of that year I was pregnant with Karen. And from there we transferred to Scary, which is on the Kokoda Trail. We were there for 4 years. That was a rehabilitation for boys who come through the courts. At the end of that time, we moved to Barocco in Port Moresby to a vocational training centre where boys were taught, boys who dropped out of school were taught basic skills in carpentry and mechanics. And then my father was the head of the welding department at the Tech in Sydney. And Bill could see the need for welding skills because there were so many break-ins. People in Moresby needed screens on their windows. And if we could weld, we could make screens and sell those and raise funds for the centre. So So when we came on leave, he went to Tech with Dad, did some basic welding training, came back and started to teach the boys welding. When Dad had his first break from tape, he flew up to Moresby to put right what Bill had done wrong. By the end, we had a national person who was reasonably well qualified to do welding, and we made frame. We did lots of work for missions around town. We made furniture, we did house repairs, and we built up a lot of contacts which raised funds for the centre. But well, they only did it for a year, and Bill felt it was not enough, so he decided he'd introduce another year. And when he was retrenched, just before he went to college, and for 3 months he was down in Singleton with his parents who were officers, walking the streets trying to find work as a carpenter to get some money before he went to college. And the man who gave him the job, Bill said, "Do you want to see my credentials?" He said, "No, show me your toolbox." And he said, "If you know how to look after your tools, you'll do me." So Bill decided that in the second year, the boys could decide whether they wanted to do carpentry, welding, or mechanics. They would make a toolbox, and with donations, Rotary connections, with donations he was able to buy the tools. The boys had their own tools, they used those tools, they maintained those tools, and a number of them, when they had graduated at the end of the second year, found jobs in town.
So that was a great time, if you like, your first term in Papua New Guinea. Now I understand that you came back to Australia, you had some time in a couple of corps, and then you found yourself back in Papua New Guinea. So could you just give us the basics of how come you went back again?
We came home at the end of '78. Bill was not well at all. We had 3 corps appointments, 18 months at Mawumbara, then 9 months at Uralla, and we were feeling great. He was getting on top. And when you come back to a country after you've been away, you have reverse culture shock. You're the same person, but the country has changed. What was Medicare? What was an ATM? What was this currency? So much had changed. So coming back in 1970, the end of 1978, Andrew was born May '79, and I wasn't well either, so it was a really stressful time. After 18 months we moved to Uralla. Beautiful, wonderful people who loved us to death and spoilt us rotten. After 9 months, in their wisdom, the army said, "You're in much better condition now, you're on the move again to Sandgate Corps in Queensland." But 3 months after we arrived, we got a letter from Colonel Newman in Port Moresby, "Will you please come back? The BBC's a mess and we need you." So we thought about it, we prayed about it, and we said to THQ, "Okay, if we go, it'll be just 3 years, because by then Karen will be due to start high school. If you can find nobody else, we will go." By return mail, we had our departure date. So we went back for 2 years. Field orders came out on 3 o'clock, October I think it was in those days. But before the children went to school that day, we told them what was going to happen, because we didn't want the Corps folk to know before they did. Karen and Peter's reaction was, "Good, we're going home."
Now I'm wondering now, if you reflect on your life, and overall, obviously a significant amount of your life was spent in Papua New Guinea, ministering to the people there, being involved with their activities, how at this point do you reflect on that as adding to your life, as what blessings do you see as coming from all of that commitment?
Well, for one thing, I learned to tithe. When I first went to Kainantu, Beulah said to me, "There's house rules here. If you don't eat, if you don't cook, you don't eat. Your name's on the roster when it's your turn to do a meeting." I said, "I'm not an officer. Doesn't matter. Your name's on the roster. You do a meeting." First self-denial appeal came around, and Beulah, Dot and Marion shared with me that their policy was to give a week's salary on for self-denial. And they said, that's what we do. It's up to you what you do, but that's what we do. I'd never considered tithing before that, but I did from then on. And God has blessed me and blessed us as a couple, and continues to do so. When first things are made first, and I can tell umpteen stories of times when we were almost down to our last dime and money came. And I believe if we honour God, he never fails us. Living with those people whose faith was so strong, in spite of the conditions under which they lived, changed us forever. Things are not important. Our relationship with God is what is most important. And I think that's one of the big lessons I learned.
Thank you. Will you join me in thanking Bev for her wonderful insight to this afternoon? Thank you.
If I can just add, Viola came to visit us once after Bill had died, and she came to Sydney to visit Phil and Jan Cairns when Phil was very ill. And I told her I was going to write my story. And she said, well, hurry up and do it before I die so I can read it. And after she left, I said to Bill, I'm going to write about those 2.5 years. So I called it, It's Been a Long Road. We lived in Bennelong Road in Toongabbie. So I called it, It's Been a Long Road. That's just 1964 to 1967 when I went to college. I'm going to have to edit it because it's not really for general publication. Some of it's a bit personal, but there are basic things in there that, you know, fundraising stuff we did. When headquarters said you can only have one classroom, and Doc said we need 2, and Beulah said, okay, we'll raise the money, and we did. Wonderful stories about how God answered our prayers for our work and for us personally.
Thank you.
Well, what an interesting and informative afternoon we've had. Absolutely fantastic. Where do I start and say thank you to these people for giving us so much information? Most of it, probably very few of us knew anything about. By the way, I did have my brother Max was in Papua New Guinea, but I don't think you could call Max a lay worker. Although he was a lay worker for the Bank of New South Wales. But anyway, that's beside the point. Ron, thanks for starting us off. You've got such an inquisitive mind. You don't let anything rest. You've got to find out all the details, which is absolutely fantastic. And we really appreciate the work and effort that you put in for this particular afternoon, but also the work that you continue to put in so many different avenues of your research and so forth. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you, and very much received. Pam, thanks again. We've enjoyed Pam and John's earlier presentation on New Guinea and their work up there, and that was extremely interesting and mind-blowing as well when you consider the conditions and so forth that they were working under. It's quite unbelievable. And then this afternoon to hear Bev. I've seen you many times, but I haven't heard of a project of historical facts. And thank you very much for putting up with me for those 10 years. But also thank you for the work you continue to do. It's much appreciated, and we as the Salvation Army really appreciate the work that you do. Thank you.
I'd like to thank John, and that's to remind
remind you that you've got, please stay for afternoon tea. It's just being prepared over here on the left as I talk, and you can take some time to read through or look at all these beautiful exhibits that you've got and chat amongst yourselves. Let's pray. Our loving and eternal Father, we thank you that when you call people to your service, you provide what they need. Sometimes it may be at the last minute, but you never forsake them. We thank you for the reminder of how so many people from this territory served in Papua New Guinea, not only officers, but as we call them, lay folk, people who felt the need, the call from you to be available to serve you in other countries, providing education, training, medical assistance, or whatever else it was that they did. Lord, we just thank you for their commitment. We thank you for the legacy that they left. We thank you for the way that Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands are now a territory in themselves. We thank you for the many officers that serve in that country because of the commitment from folk from our territory. Lord, we just thank you for the reminder. We pray that you'll continue to bless us and keep us strong in your service and fit us for heaven to be with you there. In Jesus' name.